We all know what they say about New York City. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. But let's be honest, if your apartment is so small, you're not really living here, you're kind of just trying to survive, can you really say that you've made it? In other words, how small is too small for a New York City apartment? The last time I was looking for an apartment, I approached this question as an architect and took away some really interesting discoveries about what you need to make a small space actually work, some ways in which they make listings look bigger than they actually are, and where I draw the line for how small is too small. But first, a little background. I'm Drew Paul Bell, a licensed architect in New York City, and I've been designing homes professionally for about the last 10 years. So a few years ago, I had an amazing apartment. It was a great COVID deal, and it was a 1-bedroom with a washer and dryer in unit, a dishwasher, an elevator, and it was in Nolita, which is one of the best neighborhoods in the city. But unfortunately, after I was living there for 2 years, my landlord raised the rent nearly 50%. So my time in Nolita was over. And that summer, everybody's rent was going up, and it seemed almost impossible to find a place that could actually fit the stuff that I had for a price point I could afford in a neighborhood I actually wanted to live. But living in New York was my dream, so I was committed to living like in Manhattan. And I explored other boroughs and other places, but like living in New York City was my dream. And I wanted to live in the middle of the city. I loved Lower Manhattan, I really didn't want to give it up. But as a professional architect who's designing multi-million-dollar houses, I feel like I need to maintain a minimum level of standard of my living situation. And I'm not interested in coming home to roommates, and I didn't move to New York to live in New Jersey. If I was to be critical about my last apartment on one thing though, I think that 1-bedroom actually would have worked better if it was a studio. If I had owned the place, I had thought about this, I would have knocked down the wall. Now, no landlord or real estate agent is ever going to do that because you can charge more for a 1-bedroom than you can for a studio, but this is why I think studio apartments are actually underrated. I don't think 1-bedrooms make sense when you're looking at apartments less than about 500 square feet. But once you get much smaller than that, that's when throwing up that wall to separate out the bedroom really just creates two tiny spaces. And if you're in this zone of like under 500 square feet, that's where I think studios make the most sense. It gives you more of an open plan concept, and it feels like you have a more generous room to work with. But if you're gonna live in a studio, I think you have to be intentional about 5 spaces that you need to make a small space work. These are the kinds of things where if I'm designing a home for somebody, these all get different rooms. But when we're looking at moving into a studio in a high demand, high cost of living area like Lower Manhattan, we need to be intentional about 5 spaces in my opinion. That is a space for sleeping, eating, relaxing, working, and storage. Note that this doesn't include space for like the kitchen and the bathroom because those spaces are built in and you don't really have a lot of control over that. But even when I was looking for studio apartments, I was still having a hard time finding one that could actually fit all my stuff. Because when they show listings, they have a few techniques to make apartments look bigger than they really are. One of the most common is that they have these virtually staged images. They show the furniture smaller than it really is, and then that makes the space look larger than it actually is. So that can be very misleading. And then another trick is if they list the square footage, it's almost never the net square footage, that's the inside face of the wall. They measure to the outside face of the walls, and they include square footage for the common areas like the hallways, the stairs, and the front lobby. Now they have their reasons for doing this, but that's a discussion for another video. All you need to know is that the square footages are usually not correct, and then on top of that, oftentimes listing agents will then round up even more. For example, I looked at one apartment in the Bowery that was advertised as being 600 square feet, and I thought at this price point, I could totally make that work, that would be awesome. But then when I got in there to measure the space, I could shoot dimensions with my laser measure and tell right away it was only 350. So since I couldn't trust the listings with the images or the square footage listed, I did what any architect would do. I actually drafted all my furniture to scale and tested layouts on all the different floor plans that I could find on StreetEasy and Zillow. I looked at dozens of layouts, and what I found was there's a minimum cutoff to make these 5 spaces work. We're talking about sleeping, eating, relaxing, working, and storage. And the minimum square footage, in my opinion, that you need is about 350 square feet. But most people probably can't walk into a space and just know if it's 350 square feet or not. So what else I'll give you is a couple of key dimensions that you should check to make sure that the stuff actually fits given the configuration. Because configurations can also vary. And the most straightforward dimension is 11 foot 6 inches in width. And what this width allows for is you need space to store clothes in your bedroom That's like a chest of drawers or a dresser or something like that, or a wardrobe. And then you need 30 inches of clear space between that and the foot of the bed. And then you need the length of the bed. So 11'6" accounts for everything that you need in this dimension. And I would say that you could probably even reduce this to 10'6" if you're not afraid to pinch it a little bit. But when you do that, you're kind of eliminating the opportunity to have a queen bed. You kind of have to go with a double bed max. But in a lot of these small spaces, queen beds usually don't work anyway. So you could go a little bit lower, but I still feel like 11'6" is the ideal dimension there. And when you have that 11'6" dimension, that also works for the living room layout, where you're gonna have a couch across from a TV with a coffee table, and then you still need circulation to be able to walk back and forth. Now, if we think about the other direction, that dimension has a lot more variables to consider. You need to be able to house the bedroom area, essentially, the living room area, and then tables for like dining room table and work desk. That varies a lot more, so it's hard for me to give you an exact number about what that has to be. And that's going to vary depending on your furniture and the layout that you have. But I will tell you what I was looking for when I was looking for an apartment, and I was looking for a dimension of 19 feet as a minimum dimension. Obviously more is better, and even with this configuration, note that this is only for like the living unit of like these spaces. It's not including the kitchen or the bathroom, and so you need to consider how you circulate through the space. So you have to take the actual layout of your apartment that you're looking at into consideration. But what happens if an apartment is smaller than this 350 square foot number? Once you get below 350 square feet, what we're going to be talking about is probably losing one of these spaces. Now again, these spaces that I'm talking about, these are what I feel like you need to kind of live like an adult. So whether I'm designing a multi-generational home with an in-law suite, or a pied-à-terre for somebody to have a place in the city, or we're talking about young professionals just trying to live like an adult, these are the 5 spaces that I think that you need. But there comes a season in certain people's lives where maybe they're willing to sacrifice one of those spaces. My grandfather was a businessman, and he used to always say, newsflash, we all want different things. If we all wanted the same thing, we would all be wearing the same clothes, living in the same house, and married to the same woman. And that sounds like a nightmare to me. And I think this applies here. If we look at these 5 again, sleeping is non-negotiable. You need to have a bed, and that is what it is. Storage kind of gets fit into every different room in its own little way. Wardrobe in the bedroom, credenza under the TV, bookshelves in the living room. So you usually can't get rid of some storage and reclaim enough space for a living room. So maybe you can thin that down, but in all likelihood, you're looking at losing one of these 3 other spaces: space for eating, relaxing, or working. In other words, we're talking about losing a table, a couch, or a desk. But this is where I think it actually gets really interesting, because the thing about our homes is that it all comes down to an expression of how we want to live. If you were looking at an apartment where you couldn't fit all of these spaces, you might feel like you don't need a desk because you can work on the kitchen table, or you value that nomadic lifestyle where you can go work from your laptop at the cafe down the street. Or you may feel like, I don't want work coming into my home. I want that separated. On the flip side, you may find yourself in a season of your life where focusing on your career is really important. And you know that we live in a work from home kind of a world these days, and you want to make sure you have that space preserved in your home, so that way you're never falling behind and you're keeping the projection of your career on track. You might also look at the living room and the couch and feel like, I'm not hosting 6 people over here to have movie nights, and I'm in the city to be out in the city. I don't need to relax at home on a couch. That's not what this is for. Or you might feel like you want that space at home to have a reprieve. You're going to be out in the world. You're going to be out in the busy city as much as you can, but like there are going to be times when you need to recharge and have more of a cozy night in. You might feel like it comes down to the kitchen table. Perhaps you live in the city with some of the best restaurants in the world, and you're going to eat out as much as possible and eat with other people, have these other meals outside, take advantage of the city in that regard. Or you might feel like cooking is one thing that you love to do and you love to host people over at your apartment. Even if you can only fit 1 or 2, that's something that really brings you joy. And if we zoom out and consider the fact that if you want to live in New York City, that in and of itself is an expression that you're willing to give up a little extra space or a lot of extra money on your living situation to make sure that you're living in the middle of it all. So the question I have for you is, if you had your heart set on living in a particular neighborhood and the only apartments that were available were less than 350 square feet and you had to give up one of these 3 spaces, which would it be? the couch, the desk, or the dining room table? Let me know in the comments down below. So as for my apartment search journey, I eventually found a listing that looked really interesting for a studio apartment in the East Village, a great neighborhood, one subway stop further away. I took my dimensions and I knew right away I could make this space work. In fact, I was the first person to see the apartment, and I put in my application before anybody else even saw it. And in fact, the square footage of the apartment is actually 380 square feet, not just 350, so I'm living large in the East Village. So after discussing the spaces that you need to make a small apartment work, some of the tricks that listing agents do to make apartments look bigger than they actually are, and telling you the exact dimensions that you need to be looking for a small apartment. Hopefully I've armed you with enough information so that you can move quickly when you're looking for apartments and not sign a lease on something that's actually not going to work for your stuff or for your lifestyle. So I hope this helped. Don't forget to let me know which of these 3 spaces you would let go if you had to in the comments down below, and I will talk to you next time.